The survey team moved east at a steady pace. Of course, they weren't going in a straight line. Instead, they explored the Moon River Plain, making frequent stops to let the specialists ascertain the terrain and compare the landscape with the rough map provided by the Song clan. The specialists took some time to unload their equipment from the carts, leaving the heavy lifting to the porters. The Awakened stood guard and summoned several specially provided memories to divine a few details that mundane equipment wasn't able to pick up. The team left colorful flags in its wake, which would serve as a guideline for the road crew later. At times, the entire group made camp to let Awakened Ray scout out those areas that could pose special danger, like the ruins of ancient cities. His aspect was uniquely suited for this kind of task. Although the young man was not especially lethal in direct combat, his abilities allowed the survey team to only consist of 3 Awakened instead of a dozen or more. Awakened Fleur was similarly indispensable. Her aspect was responsible for the startling speed with which the team was covering distance. Not only could she help everyone recover their stamina, but the scrapes and wounds received in the rare skirmishes with the nightmare creatures were quickly healed. If anything, it was Tamar of Sorrow that seemed to bring the least to the table. However, that was merely an illusion, because it was the young legacy who took point when things did not go according to plan. Ray's aspect was mostly useful for avoiding trouble, while Fleur could resolve the dire consequences. However, it was the unexpected and inevitable that was not only the most common, but also the deadliest threat in the dream realm. Whenever the survey team faced unexpected danger, it was Tamar's sword that dealt with it. But all in all, there weren't that many unfortunate accidents. Rain had expected that she would have to string her bow sooner or later, but it stayed safely attached to her pack, at least for now. She continued to work on forming her soul core in peace. In fact, strangely enough, her life as Rani was much more peaceful than her life as Rain. It was not only because she didn't have to hurt nightmare creatures anymore, but also because of the circumstances. The wilderness was vast and tranquil, much different from the bustling liveliness of Ravenheart and the overcrowded sterility of NQSC. There was no ever-present noise, no familiar anxiety, no light pollution to dull the beautiful stars. The weather was harsh, but not nearly as oppressive as the murderous cold and searing heat of the Ashen Mountains. Rain was enjoying herself. She quite liked walking across the desolate plain and feeling the cool wind play with her hair, watching the 3 moons travel across the velvet sky at night, and not having to worry about anything except for her work well and controlling the flow of essence. The company wasn't bad either. She was on friendly terms with most of the porters, who were all warm and nice people. The tough and prickly Elga, the somber and taciturn Pill, the former PTV magnate Old Goat, Corel. The standoffish survey specialists lost most of their aloof attitude after a few days and often joined them around the fire in the evening. Even the 3 Awakened became easier to talk to after everyone had grown a bit familiar with each other. Despite the grim danger of exploring the wilderness, the mood of the survey team was strangely peaceful sometimes. Rain felt like she was observing their small group from the side. In those moments, she was suddenly struck by the eerie dissonance between the peacefulness of their days and the dark shadow of the approaching war. She was talking to Sunny through the mind link again as she took the walk.
Aren't you worried? This war is looming above our heads.
Worried? Not really. Life is war, you know. When you live long enough, you get used to such things. Rain frowned in the darkness.
But you are so powerful. You destroyed the vessels of the Skinwalker easily. Don't you even feel a little bit responsible? Aren't you going to do something?
The darkness chuckled. Responsible? Well, I guess I do feel a little bit responsible. And who says that I'm not going to do something? Rain held her breath for a few moments.
Teacher, what are you going to do?
He let out a contemplative sigh and then laughed quietly. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll kill both sovereigns and put someone dependable in charge of humanity. Or go bird hunting. Or make waffles. Something like that. She stared into the darkness for a while, then scoffed.
Well, good luck. I must say, though, for someone who hides from everyone in a young girl's shadow, teacher, you sure talk a big game.
The darkness responded with appalled silence. After a while, he hissed, Go to sleep, you ingrate. And for your information, I'm not hiding in your shadow. I'm just taking temporary residence here. For convenience. Rain smiled and went back to her bed. The next day, they reached the boundary of the survey area. As they ventured further east, the Moon River Plain started to change. There were fewer and fewer canyons in their way, and the air grew a little warmer. At night, the three beautiful moons seemed more distant. The wind carried with it swirling black flakes. Rain did not need to touch them to know what they were. Ash. It was as if they had returned to Ravenheart, but also different. Back in the stronghold of Clan Song, the ash fell from the frigid sky because of the raging volcanoes. But here, it was somehow different, making Rain feel uncomfortable. Eventually, the members of the survey team stopped. No one had given the command, but they simply froze in place, looking at the horizon in stunned silence. Wow. Out there, in front of them, far away, it seemed as if a snowy mountain chain was rising from the ashen haze. But as Rain studied the towering mountains closer, she couldn't help but feel a sense of incongruity, because the shape was wrong. Then, something clicked in her mind, and she opened her mouth in shock or horror or awe. The mountains weren't mountains at all. Instead, they were bones. An inconceivably large skeleton lay on the ground in the distance, too large to be seen whole. What Rain had thought to be the slopes of a mountain chain were several titanic ribs, each rising into the sky like ivory pillars that supported its weight. The skull of the unfathomable corpse was mercifully out of view. The closest group of bone mountains, however, extended far into the Moon River Plain. It was also shaped strangely, consisting of 5 lower peaks. Beyond them, a wide ridge rose gradually to a great height, like an eerie stairway to heaven. The 5 mountains were the phalanxes of the colossal skeleton's fingers, and the rising ridge were the bones of its arm. One of the porters whispered quietly, Gods. Rain remained silent, but she felt like uttering something like that herself. There were simply no words to describe her emotions. Awakened Ray glanced at them and smiled faintly. Gods. A god, maybe. That is Godgrave ahead of us. The porters, who were not very well acquainted with the topography of the Dream Realm, looked at him in confusion. He sighed. Godgrave is a death zone that serves as the northeastern boundary of the Song domain. It is the region of the Dream Realm where great, cursed, and maybe even unholy abominations dwell. As for why it is called that, I think you can see for yourself. Nobody really knows what the terrible skeleton is, but it's easy to imagine that these are the remains of a god. Therefore, Godgrave. The porters shivered. Awakened Ray, sir. Are we going there? Ray smiled, but it was Tamar, the leader of the survey team, who answered. No, of course not. A death zone is not a place for humans. Even if we aren't devoured by some abominable horror, the land itself will kill us. Or the sky. More importantly than that. She glanced at the porters and the survey specialists. This is where the Song domain ends.
Queen Song's authority does not reach Godgrave, so you can't go there. As soon as you do, your souls won't be protected by the Queen's grace anymore, and you'll be summoned into the first nightmare.
She sighed.
In short, our mission is complete. We will camp here and return tomorrow. Returning to the main camp should not take us nearly as long as it took to come here, since we'll be going in a straight line. The marching will be more intense, so prepare yourselves.
With that, she turned her back to the incredible sight of the colossal bones, as if not at all impressed by it. The porters looked at the young legacy with confusion. After a bit of awkward silence, one of them asked,
"That lady's father must have been terribly busy."
She furrowed her brow.
He wasn't.
Then Tamar blinked.
I mean, he was. He is. But that is not why.
Actually, Rain knew what she meant. There might have been a safer way to awaken for most sleepers, but not for legacies. That was because the legacies had always had such an option. They just never used it. For them, the trial of the nightmare spell was like a sacred rite. Legacies were fundamentally a warrior caste, the martial aristocracy of the New World. Their culture was uniquely harsh and unforgiving, forging them into people capable of facing the senseless terror of the nightmare spell. They took their valiance seriously. Being sent into the dream realm on the winter solstice was a rite of passage. Some would say that it was an unnecessary risk, maybe even point to the Forgotten Shore as an example. Thousands of young men and women had perished there before Changing Star finally conquered the gateway. But at the same time, those who had survived were among the strongest champions of humanity now. Most were masters, and some were even saints. Changing Star herself, Song of the Fallen, Nightingale, Raised by Wolves, those were legendary names. So even if Tamar's father had been afraid of sending his daughter to her death, he would have still done it, because that was how legacies were. Rain sighed.
That is so messed up.
How had the leader of Clan Sorrow felt, willingly putting his daughter's life at risk? How had Tamar felt, knowing that her parents would rather see her dead than weak? Things like that would mess with one's head for life. Suddenly, Rain didn't want to mock the young legacy anymore. She lingered for a few moments, then asked curiously,
But how did you survive? As Lady Tamar said, a death zone is no place for humans. To make it out alive, it's like a miracle.
The three awakened looked at each other somberly. Eventually, Ray answered with a pale smile.
We received help.
Fleur shivered.
Yeah, no human can live in a death zone. But actually, one human does. Well, at least he seems like a human. Nobody is really sure.
Tamar nodded with a dark expression.
He was the one who saved us, the Lord of Shadows.
The Lord of Shadows.
The porters shivered. Night had fallen, and only the light of the bonfire illuminated the desolate plain. Flakes of ash danced in the air. Far away, the white phalanxes of the dead deity towered above the plain like mountains, and 3 pale moons were drowning in the darkness of the cold sky. It was a perfect environment to tell a scary story. Awakened Ray smiled faintly.
Yes, the Lord of Shadows.
Rain shifted a little to hear him better. She was haunted by an insufferable shadow, so of course anything that had to do with shadows was of interest to her. The young man took a deep breath, cradled a cup of fragrant tea in his hands, and continued.
Out there in Godgrave, the sky is usually covered by clouds. When the veil of clouds is torn, blinding light pours from an incandescent white abyss, incinerating anything that moves. But there is a place where light can never reach, a land that is forever shrouded in darkness, Out there in the darkness stands an ancient temple built of black stone. That is where the Lord of Shadows lives.
Rain stared at awakened Ray incredulously.
Is he an idiot?
The young man had good control of his voice, drawing the listeners into the scene he was describing. But no, what was he doing? Were they in a theater? Why couldn't he just speak normally? Awakened Fleur turned away, blushing from embarrassment. Tamar of Sorrow closed her eyes with a stoic expression. The porters, though, seemed delighted and leaned forward a little, enjoying the story. Rain blinked a couple of times, then did the same, not wishing to stand out. Awakened Ray continued.
The Lord of Shadows is believed to be a reclusive saint, but nobody knows for sure where he comes from. Nobody even knows if he is a human, really. He always wears a suit of black armor and wears a fearsome black mask. His voice is cold and insidious, and his powers are great beyond belief. He lives alone in the dark temple, surrounded by the devils who serve him.
The young man took a deep breath and then said quietly, allowing his voice to tremble a little.
It's true. I've been to the temple and saw those devils myself. One is a living statue of a beautiful female knight. One is a towering hellspawn forged from black metal. One is an enormous serpent whose body envelops the entire temple, its scales like polished onyx. However, none of them are as frightening as the Lord of Shadows himself. His mask is carved from black wood, in the image of an ancient fiend, and looking into its eyes is like looking into the abyss itself.
He shivered and shook his head.
I thought that I'd die right there and then, looking at him. However, the Lord of Shadow just stared at me for a while, unmoving, and then said in a voice that lacked all human emotion, I've decided not to kill you, Dreamer Ray. As if he needed a reason to allow someone to live, instead of a reason to take someone's life.
Rain secretly threw a glance at her own shadow. How come that Lord of Shadows lived in a palatial temple and had a bunch of powerful minions serving him, while her teacher did not even have a place to stay? Was her teacher a bum among shadows?
Unfair,
one of the porters asked in a trembling voice.
But, Awakened Ray, sir, how did you end up in that evil temple?
Ray opened his mouth to answer, but it was Fleur who spoke first, perhaps afraid that he'd say something nonsensical. But after a while, Rain interrupted the story with,
Changing Star taught me swordsmanship.
As all of them looked at her in disbelief, or amusement, she wasn't sure.
What the hell am I doing?
Why was she spouting nonsense? That was not like her at all. But unexpectedly, it was also a bit fun.
Oh no, teacher has corrupted me.
The porters stared at her, then exploded with laughter.
Right. So, Ranny, what is Lady Changing Star like?
Are you sure that she taught you swordsmanship? Didn't you teach her instead? No one has seen that Lord Shadow without a mask. Maybe it was Ranny all along.
Rain spared them a bright smile.
Well, have you ever seen me and the Lord of Shadows in the same room?
There was another bout of laughter. Sometime later, the roasted meat was finished, and the members of the survey team went back to their tents. The three awakened decided which one of them would guard the camp first and followed suit. Rain spent several hours reviving her essence. Deep at night, she finally sprawled on her sleeping bag in total exhaustion. She lingered for a while, then asked quietly,
Hey, teacher, do you know about the Lord of Shadows?
He remained silent for a while.
Sure. I know him quite well. Why are you asking?
Rain smiled in the darkness.
No reason. It's just that you are a shadow and he's the Lord of Shadows, so, is he like your superior?
Her teacher's voice revealed a hint of indignation.
Who, that clown?
My superior? If I wanted to, I could erase him from existence with a thought.
She chuckled.
But he has a huge temple and a bunch of powerful servants. He also seems close with Lady Nephis. Didn't you say once that you're practically her boyfriend? Sorry, I don't mean to sound rude, but it seems more like he is her boyfriend instead.
Her teacher was appalled.
I did say that, and by the way, I am. I asked her on a date and she agreed. She was delighted to agree even. Who can resist my charm?
Rain grinned.
I'm just saying that Lord of Shadows, he seems to know what's what. Won't the other shadows mock you for being an underachiever because of him? No temple, no servants, no beautiful saintess hanging on your arm? I pity my poor teacher. Teacher is such an ascetic.
Instead of an answer, a threatening growl resounded from the darkness. Her teacher seemed to be sulking and did not speak with her the next morning. Rain crawled out of her tent, disassembled it, and prepared for a long day of marching across the desolate plain. She was in a good mood because of having managed to tease her teacher successfully last night. There was no need to do the survey work anymore, so the team moved west at a brisk pace. They were also familiar with the terrain and could follow an optimal route instead of wandering aimlessly. Of course, Tamar of Sorrow had been exaggerating a bit when she said that they would go in a straight line. The Moon River Plain was within the borders of the Song Domain, but the only citadel here was far to the south, at its very edge. And since there was nothing but the Hollow Mountains to the north, this land was wild and dangerous. There were plenty of nightmare creatures here, and so the survey team had to avoid the hunting grounds of the more dangerous abominations. Still, they were making good progress. The further west they went, the more canyons barred their path. By now, the members of the survey team were very familiar with crossing them, so much so that it had almost become a habit. They would try to find the place where a stone bridge once stood, since the canyons were usually narrow there. The remains of the bridges also further narrowed the chasm. Then young Tamar would mount her wolf echo and leap over the canyon while holding a rope. After fastening it on one side, she would raise a simple pulley system. The carts and equipment would be transported over the chasm first, and the people would follow. The whole process was a bit tiring, but not especially dangerous. Even if the canyon started to wail and was suddenly flooded by rushing water, the ropes remained above the powerful current. The porters just had to be careful not to look down. The canyons were incredibly deep, their depths shrouded in inky darkness. Falling down meant death. The currents, however, were incredibly violent, so falling into the water was not much safer. The survey team reached another canyon and went through the familiar motions. This one was not very wide, but it was still going to take some effort to transport all the equipment to the other side. Rain, who was usually one of the last people to traverse the chasm, leaned on the cart she had been pulling and took a deep breath. Since the crossing was monotonous, and they had already gone through the process countless times, it was easy to grow numb and allow one's mind to wander. However, even while presenting a relaxed facade, Rain still maintained vigilance. She knew all too well that a moment of carelessness could mean death in the dream realm, which was why she was one of the first people to see it. Tamar and her echo were already on the other side, and the ropes were drawn across the chasm. The carts had been attached to the hooks and pulled over the canyon. Now it was time for humans to follow. There were 3 ropes, one for them to walk over, 2 to hold with their hands. Awakened Fleur was in the middle of crossing, and one of the survey specialists was waiting for his turn to follow. However, Rain was suddenly distracted by something. It was the dead man standing a small distance away from the resting porters. His gaze was just as empty and expressionless as ever. However, he had just turned his head, silently facing the canyon. She frowned. The pilgrim had always been passive and quiet. He never did anything except for following the survey team. Why had he moved now? Crap. Tamar had severed one at the wrist, but 3 hands were already reaching toward her. 2 more were gripping the edge of the canyon, pushing the giant up. There was barely any time to react. The young Legacy did something that most warriors would never do in a battle. She jumped high into the air, dragging the great length of the brutish Zweihander behind her. A jump was usually tantamount to death, because one could not control their direction or react to the opponent's attacks without standing on the ground. A strike delivered in the air was also weaker than a strike delivered while using a solid surface for support. However, that did not apply to Tamar. She pushed off the air once, soaring to greater height, and then once more, changing her trajectory completely. At the same time, she spun like a wheel and brought the Zweihander down on the enemy's arm. This time, the force contained in the strike was not augmented by the startling speed of her awakened ability, but it was still fearsome. The arm of the abomination was not severed, but the great sword bit deep, not only slicing the veins and muscles, but also cracking the bone. She had evaded the other 2 hands by jumping over them as well. Tamar would have been clear if not for the fact that at that moment, the creature's 2 sinister eyes locked on her, and another 3 hands shot at her from the canyon. The young Legacy faltered for a split second. Then a sharp arrow whistled past her and pierced one of the abomination's eyes. A moment later, another arrow sank into the remaining eye of the hideous nightmare creature, effectively blinding it. A pained roar shook the plain. Landing on the ground, Tamar activated her awakened ability and dodged to the right, avoiding the grab of the blinded abomination. She would have been in trouble if it could see, but now things were different. Shaking the fetid blood off the blade of her greatsword, she prepared to attack and glanced back briefly. Ray was busy pushing back the severed hand, so who had made those stunningly accurate shots? The beautiful porter girl, Rani, was standing near the pile of unloaded equipment, holding a simple recurve bow. Her black hair was dancing in the wind, and there was a strangely serene expression on her pale face. Her black eyes were glistening with something that resembled excitement. She was already drawing the bow again, the fletching of a handmade arrow brushing against her white cheek. A little stunned, Tamar turned back to the enormous abomination.
She did say that she was decent with a bow.
If that was decent, then Tamar did not even know what great was. As she pushed her body forward, a stray thought surfaced in her mind. Rani had also said that she had some experience trekking in the wilderness and could handle a sword fine. Suddenly, Tamar wanted to know what her definition of fine was. The situation was not good. Ray had managed to stall the monstrous hand, hacking it to pieces with his weapons. He wielded a short sword in one hand and an axe in the other. Rain had blinded the abomination with her arrows, and Tamar disabled 2 of its arms. The problem was that the creature had just too many of them. Rain had already counted 9, and more were rising from behind the climbing monstrosity like a ghastly forest. Worse still, it was an awakened abomination. She had aimed at the obvious vulnerability first, the eyes, but other than that, there wasn't a lot of damage she could do. Even if her arrows pierced through the tough hide of the creature, it would not harm it too much. Tamar faced the forest of monstrous arms with grim resolve. Wielding her hefty Zweihander with daunting skill, she used both of her abilities to dance between the barrage of killing blows. The young Legacy seemed like a steel whirlwind, alternating unpredictable jumps with short bursts of stunning speed. Torrents of fetid blood were released into the frigid air from her great blade. She managed to stall and damage many limbs of the abomination, in large part due to the creature having been blinded, but could not advance to attack its body.
Crap.
Rain dropped her bow and unsheathed her sword.
Why are you just standing there? Get back!
The petrified porters were stirred by her shout and staggered away from the carnage. Miraculously, none of them was dead yet. The abominable claws rained down in pursuit of the elusive legacy girl, sending pieces of stone flying. A net of cracks spread on the ground from each missed blow, viscous blood spilling into the narrow fissures. Rain dashed forward and supported awakened Ray, who had managed to sever 2 of the hideous hand's fingers, but almost got pierced by the long claw of the third. They were in a stalemate, and that stalemate wasn't in their favor. The creature was continuing to climb up from the canyon, and once it crawled out onto the plain, whatever resistance Tamar was able to offer would be overwhelmed. So someone had to reach the abomination and deal it a mortal wound. Rain would have gone herself, but she was mundane. Her Tachi would not be able to slay the giant. Ray, on the other hand, was awakened and wielded enchanted weapons. Better yet, he could become imperceptible, so with some luck, his blade would reach the creature's neck without being blocked by the countless claws.
Go! I'll finish this thing off!
The young man glanced at her with wide eyes, hesitated for a split second, then nodded and disengaged. He must have thought the same. A moment later, Ray was gone. Literally. He activated his awakened ability and dissolved into the air. There was no sound, no smell, no anything. It was as if he had never existed at all. Rain brandished her Tachi, deflected a terrifying claw, and then kicked the severed hand with all her might. The hand was the size of an adult human and weighed quite a lot. Still, Rain's kick sent it rolling backward. With 2 fingers missing, it had turned rather clumsy. The bizarre thing was still trying to turn itself over when she dashed forward, turned her sword, and thrust it down, using all of her own weight to make the strike more powerful. The Tachi pierced the monstrous palm, slid between the bones, and nailed the severed hand to the ground. It was a mundane blade, so an awakened abomination could easily snap it. However, even an abomination would have to follow a common reason to achieve that. It would need proper grip and support, at least, ideally good leverage. Laying on the ground, impaled through the center, the monstrous hand had none of those, so it just struggled fiercely, unable to free itself for now. Rain staggered back, then looked up to evaluate the situation. Tamar had managed to sever several more arms, but was hopelessly stuck in the avalanche of monstrous limbs. Blinded, the creature flailed them with no sense or reason, making a mess of the plain. Ray would be having trouble closing in as well. He might have been invisible, but the space between the survey team and the massive body of the climbing abomination was full of stone shards and deadly claws. Ray was still a corporeal being, so making his way through the carnage was not going to be easy. On the opposite side of the canyon, Fleur had climbed the ropes and was now standing on the edge, shouting something as she summoned her memories. Rain couldn't quite hear what the pretty healer was shouting, but she managed to read her lips. Picking up her quiver, Rain lamented the loss of several arrows, then circled around the pinned hand of the tyrant and approached the edge of the chasm. She stopped near Ray and Tamar. All 3 of them looked down. The depths of the canyon were shrouded in darkness, and it was impossible to say how far down its bottom was. Ray swept his hair back nervously and looked at them.
Do you think it's dead?
Tamar lingered for a moment, then pursed her lips and hesitantly shook her head.
I haven't heard anything from the spell.
Turning back, she glanced at the severed hand that Rain had pinned to the ground with her sword.
Go finish that thing off, Ray. It should be the tyrant's minion. What a bizarre creature by the dead gods.
Who had countless hands instead of proper minions? Ray sighed, then readied his weapons and headed away from the edge. A storm of sparks rose around the legacy girl, and then the wolf echo manifested itself behind her. There was no need to let it be damaged by the fall. She had simply dismissed it, then summoned it back. Finally, Tamar turned to Rain and studied her for a moment. Then she scowled.
You?
However, before she could finish the sentence, a chilling wail resounded from the depths of the canyon, reverberating across the plain. It was like the world itself was weeping. The flood was coming. It was impossible to hear her voice now, this close to the chasm. It was also impossible to discern what Fleur was shouting. Rain stared across the canyon in confusion. The awakened healer was jumping and waving her hands in the air, pointing at them with a desperate expression on her lovely face.
Akop, ing, all, ak.
Rain could barely hear anything because of the wailing.
Ak? What is trying to pack? Attack? Crack? Back?
She guessed. Suddenly, her eyes widened. Rain looked at Tamar in panic, but it was already too late. The edge of the canyon had been damaged severely by the barrage of blows dealt to it by the tyrant. The weathered stone was broken and cracked, and just then, it finally crumbled. Before Rain could do anything, the entire side of the canyon suddenly moved and then collapsed, falling into the wailing darkness, and the two of them were pulled down with it, plummeting into the bottomless chasm alongside countless tons of broken stone. Life was like that. You could train your body tirelessly to turn it into a tenacious, resilient tool. You could practice swordsmanship and archery until your hands bled, temper your observation skills and analytical thinking, and test yourself against countless opponents in real combat to turn shallow knowledge into deeply rooted experience. And then, you can still die because of nothing but bad luck. Rain felt resentful as she plummeted into a bottomless abyss, surrounded by an avalanche of shattered stone. But no, that was not true. Her current predicament was not due to misfortune. She was at fault. It was her who had not been cautious enough, perceptive enough, and smart enough. All the signs had been there: the cracks in the stone, the weathered state of the canyon walls, the devastating power of the tyrant's blows. She should have put two and two together. She should have done better. So Rain had no one to blame but herself. Still, she was indignant. To die like that, it was really unfair. All these thoughts flashed through her mind in the span of a moment. Then, she gritted her teeth and tried to think of a way to survive. First things first. The fall itself would not kill her just yet. The bottom of the canyon was far away, and she could survive bouncing off its walls once or twice. The most pressing threat were the falling boulders. They were massive and heavy enough to turn Rain into a pancake, or at least smash her skull open. Raising her arms, she tried to shield her head. A moment later, something slammed into her forearms, and she felt sharp pain. Luckily, the boulder was not large enough to crush her, so her bones weren't even broken. The next one, though, catching a glimpse of it, Rain shuddered. It was like a wall of rock was pursuing her, mere moments away from colliding with her fragile body. There was no chance to evade. A moment before she was crushed by the massive slab of stone, however, something strange happened. The darkness seemed to touch it lightly, and the enormous boulder shattered into a million pieces. Instead of being killed, Rain was simply showered by small pieces of debris.
Teacher!
Her teacher rarely helped her directly. However, it seemed that he was unwilling to let his student perish so senselessly and interfered, just like he had interfered to keep the porters and surveyors from being ravaged by the tyrant.
I take back all the bad words I've called him.
There was no time to feel touched, but Rain still felt a strange warmth in her heart. Then, she turned her head to find the only source of salvation there was, apart from her eccentric shadow companion, Tamar of Sorrow. The legacy girl could take 2 steps on the air, so if anyone could help Rain survive, it was her. If she would even bother wasting her time to save a mundane porter, of course, it would be much easier, not to mention safer, to only worry about herself and let Rain fall to her death.
Where is she?
Everything was happening so fast, but time also seemed to slow down. Plummeting into the wailing darkness, Rain looked around feverishly and tried to catch a glimpse of young Lady Tamar. but she could not see her. However, that was not because Tamar was nowhere to be seen. Rather, it was because Rain was looking too far. She did not expect that the legacy was nearly upon her, and only realized it when something blocked her vision.
What?
Then Rain gasped as something hard rammed into her abdomen. She studied the sky for a bit, then flinched and sat up. She was laying on the solid ground, surrounded by the vast expanse of the Moon River Plain. There was a small fire crackling near her, with her teacher warming his pale hands over it. The battered figure of Tamar of Sorrow was laying on the other side of the fire. She seemed to be in rough shape, and still unconscious. Rain blinked slowly.
We're alive.
That was good news. The bad news was that she had no idea how they had escaped the canyon and where they were. She vaguely remembered being surrounded by soft darkness and carried by the raging current, but then, at some point, she must have passed out. It was hard to differentiate one part of the plane from the other, but Rain did not think that she recognized the surroundings. The members of the survey team were nowhere in sight either. Letting out a deep sigh, she turned to her teacher and asked hoarsely,
What happened?
He looked at her and smiled.
Well, you two fell into the river, and I fished you out.
Rain nodded slowly.
How far were we carried by the current?
He shrugged.
Pretty far.
It's okay.
Since both of them were alive, the situation could still be salvaged. They could find the survey team and return to the main camp of the road crew, or proceed to one of the advanced camps on their own. Or, Rain looked at her teacher and forced out a smile.
Teacher, you are so kind and powerful. Can't you now take us back?
He responded with a smile of his own.
Oh, sure I can.
However, his voice was a little sinister.
Look at that poor girl, Tamar. She's barely alive. It would be really kind of me to take you both back, wouldn't it? One might even say that only a heartless monster wouldn't. So, I really should. But I won't.
Rain's smile grew a little forced.
What? Really? Come on, it won't even be that hard for you.
Her teacher nodded.
Really? If you want to get out of here alive, well, what can I say? All you have to do is awaken. Do that and you'll be fine.
With that, he gave her a pleasant smile and disappeared into her shadow. A moment later, his voice resounded from the darkness.
Alternatively, that Lord of Shadows, he seems to know what's what. You can ask him for help.
Rain stared at her shadow incredulously, then took a deep breath.
I take back everything I took back. That petty bastard.
After welcoming the firekeepers for a few short days, the nameless temple had grown silent once again. However, the silence was not going to last long. Soon enough, the dark realm that Sunny had built in the heart of Godgrave would become a hive of activity. Due to the deal he had made with Morgan, his citadel was to be made into a secondary staging ground for the Sword Army during the war. A relatively small but elite contingent would be stationed here, using the temple as their operation base, but the peace and quiet would be gone long before that. After all, the soldiers had to live somewhere. They needed beds, places to cook and consume food, storage space to keep a large amount of supplies, an infirmary, and so on. All of these things had to be built before the war started. There were so many things that went into waging a war. A military conflict between Awakened was different in many ways, but was still fundamentally similar to any other war in human history. It demanded an unfathomable amount of logistical preparations. Sunny felt dejected. It had taken him a lot of effort to restore the Nameless Temple to its present state. Now, however, it would be turned into an actual citadel, a place that existed to serve as a safe haven for the people of the Dream Realm. There would be a small army of workers coming here to perform all the laborious tasks soon, which was not a bad thing. However, he had grown used to the peaceful silence. Today, there were only 2 humans under the roof of the ancient temple. One of them was Sunny himself. The other was Cassia, who had arrived as the seneschal of the great clan Valor to assess the state of the citadel and collect all the necessary information to launch the construction. At least that was the official reason. Sonny had thought that Nephis would come personally. He was a little relieved that she was not here. His mind was burning in anticipation of their upcoming date, so seeing her before that would have been somewhat embarrassing. It was nice to see Cassia outside the context of their deal as well.
The temple itself must be off limits to the soldiers, unless of course it is to use the gateway. Of course they can retreat inside if we are under attack and the outer perimeter is breached. Even then, I will not allow them to venture into the inner sanctum and the underground level.
Cassia turned her head slightly.
Is there an underground level?
Sonny smiled.
Don't pretend you don't know. Nephis saw it, which means that you saw it too.
The young woman coughed in embarrassment.
Right, sorry. It's a habit of mine to act appropriately oblivious. Otherwise people get uncomfortable around me.
He spared her a long look. Since it was only the two of them in the temple, Sonny had dismissed Weaver's mask. It felt strange to walk around with a bare face as the Lord of Shadows, even if Cassia could not see his expression, only her own. He shook his head.
I doubt there is anyone in the world who knows the extent of your abilities and the depth of your foresight better than me, Cassia. So you don't need to worry about making me feel uncomfortable. There is also no one who knows me better than you now. There is really no other person either of us can trust more.
She smiled faintly.
I'll keep that in mind. The 6 of us who came back from the Tomb of Ariel all have strange gaps in our memory. But my memory has been affected the most. Sorry I haven't revealed that secret to anyone before you, Sonny. And it's not easy to admit. My memory is really severely damaged, and I can't see the future anymore.
She took a deep breath.
But there was a time when my memory was intact and I could learn a lot about the future from my visions. That version of me must have known that there would be a war, and that Nephis would have to defeat the sovereigns without challenging the 4th nightmare.
Sonny considered her words carefully.
You mean?
Cassia nodded.
Yes, if that version of me did not attempt to create contingencies, it means that she saw a way to win the war. Therefore, perhaps it is not as big of a gamble as you think.
Sonny hesitated for a while. He knew that Cassia had been in a fragile mental state for the past 4 years, not only because of losing her ability to see glimpses of the future, but also because much of her past was shrouded by fog. After all, he had been the purpose and cornerstone of all her schemes, and her schemes were truly life-consuming. When he turned fateless, a huge chunk had been ripped out of her memory, replaced by oblivion, so he didn't really want to dispel her hopes, but it wasn't good to let her rely on them either. He sighed.
Or you have never known about the future after the Tomb of Ariel at all, because the future has always been meant to become unclear after that.
Suddenly, there was a strange intensity on Cassia's delicate face. She faced him and kept quiet for a few long moments, struggling to contain her emotions. Sonny had an idea of what she was thinking about.
Even if I ask you, I won't remember the answers, will I?
He shook his head slowly.
You won't.
Of course, it would be great if Sonny could fill the gaps in her memory and let Cassia feel like herself again, but he couldn't. Between the two of them, there was a peculiar and bitter connection. Sonny had been forgotten by the world, but Cassia had forgotten herself. He struggled to judge which one of them was more pitiful. Still, he wanted to console her, even if only a little. Sonny looked away with a sigh.
Of course, that doesn't mean that you never will.
Cassia seemed frozen by his words. She raised a hand, then lowered it again.
Is there a way for your existence to be restored?
Sonny hesitated with a dark expression on his face. Of course, he had been contemplating that issue for a long time. In the end, he had determined that there was. There was a single question at the root of the problem. Why had the thieving bird stolen his fate? Sure, the loathsome thing seemed to be obsessed with everything that concerned Weaver, but Sonny did not think that that was the only reason. After pondering the question for a while, he had developed a certain suspicion. He had lost the connection to the nightmare spell after becoming fateless, which meant that carrying the nightmare spell had something to do with one's fate. Perhaps fate was the medium through which the infection spread. In any case, the creature which now possessed his fate would therefore possess his connection to the nightmare spell as well. So why would the thieving bird want something like that? To answer that question, one had to realize that the creature that Sunny had met in the nightmare was not the real thieving bird. The real thieving bird was long dead. Instead, the odious thing he had run into at the estuary was a replica of the vile terror created by the spell, and the replica could only exist in the illusory realm of the nightmare. A carrier of the spell, however, a carrier of the spell would be expelled back into the real world once the nightmare was over. They would have a way to go back. So Sunny had come to believe that the real reason why the thieving bird wanted his fate was to become a carrier of the nightmare spell and slip through the cracks of the illusory realm, finding a back door to reality. If so, that would be the greatest prison break in history, quite a suitable feat for the greatest and most vile thief to have ever lived. Very few creatures could find a way back into existence after having been destroyed for thousands of years, and in such an original way. Therefore, the creature that had stolen his fate was now in possession of it and not gone. It had not been erased forever by the collapse of the nightmare. It was somewhere out there, in the real world, liberated from its illusory prison and free to roam the world, stealing anything that had caught its fancy, which meant that it could be hunted down and killed, and that he could get his fate back from it, somehow. Sunny was nowhere near powerful enough to risk facing a cursed terror, let alone a cursed terror that neither gods nor daemons had been able to deal with. Even the void beings were said to have loathed the vile thieving bird, which meant that they had suffered from its mischief as well. The damned bird was a real menace. More importantly, though, he didn't know if he even wanted to get his fate back. Despite everything, he wasn't sure, because there were strings attached to regaining his fate, both literally and figuratively. Some days, Sunny woke up and wanted nothing more than to be remembered. Some days, he woke up and felt that he would never give up his freedom, which he had paid for so dearly. But Cassia deserved to know that there was a possibility at least. He sighed.
There is a way. However,
Sunny's voice turned heavy.
there is a price to pay if one wishes to become fateless. There is also a price to pay if one wishes to become fated, and I am not sure if I want to pay that price.
They reached the courtyard, where a lonesome tree stood, its leaves rustling in the darkness. The tree was feeling much better after being tended to by Shakti. It was doing much better, in fact, than it had in the outskirts, even though there was no sun to shine on its leaves and bathe it in warmth. The two of them looked at it in silence, Sunny with his own eyes, and Cassia as well. That was another reason why he was clinging to his secret so desperately, feeling a strange reluctance to let go of the act. Sunny leaned back.
Sometimes I wonder what we will become if we succeed. A supreme being must be even further from being human. What about a sacred being? What about a divine one?
He remained silent for a while, staring at his tea with a bleak expression. Then he said somberly,
There was a time when I harbored great hate against the sovereigns because they were distant, because they were corrupt, because they treated human lives as currency and did nothing when people died.
With a deep sigh, Sunny straightened his back and looked at the rustling leaves of the lonesome tree for a while.
And yet, haven't I spent these last few years doing nothing while people died? Such hypocrisy. Of course, I had my reason. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what a single saint does. A pawn can struggle and strive, but the players are the ones who decide the outcome of the game. So, right now, I am biding my time to replace the morally corrupt players. It's for the greater good.
A sad smile twisted his lips.
But then, I am sure that this is what the sovereigns think as well, that what they are doing, no matter how callous, is for the greater good.
Cassia remained silent for a long time, then shook her head decisively.
There is a big difference between us and the sovereigns.
Sunny raised an eyebrow.
There is?
She nodded.
Yes, it is that we are ashamed of our faults, while they are not. It might sound stupid, but that matters. It matters more than you can think.
He laughed.
That's it? The only difference is that when we do something distasteful, we feel regret?
Cassia shrugged.
There is no need to think in absolutes. It is a fallacy. We also don't send assassins to kill little girls or try to unleash nightmare creatures in populous cities. The extent of one's willingness to do despicable things for what they perceive as the greater good is also important, not just the principle. More importantly, we are also competent, while they are not. The end only justifies the means if you actually reach the end.
She hesitated for a moment, and then smiled.
Or, if you prefer, one can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. But if they break the eggs and can't even make an omelet, then they shouldn't be allowed in the kitchen. Don't you think so?
Sunny chuckled.
That sounds pretty reasonable. Thanks for leveling with me.
He picked up the cup and took a sip of the fragrant tea, then leaned forward and smiled.
Now then, shall we discuss the details of how we are going to make this omelet?